Crooked River, Chapter 12. "He's real handsome looking, isn't he?" Laura whispered after Mr. Kelly had gone up the stairs. "Never saw him in the settlement before, have you?" "You think he's truly acquainted with Indian John?" I asked. Laura shook her head. "No, I don't see how. Still—" She gave a half smile and smoothed her apron with her hands. "I think it would be kind to ask him to stay for tea, don't you? For all his troubles?" But as we got out the tin of tea and set the water to boil, I think it gave both of us a jolt when we suddenly realized that Mr. Kelly was talking with Indian John upstairs. Talking, and his voice was speaking in words that were no longer English. At first, me and Laura just stared wide-eyed at the ceiling, planks above our heads, still as two stones. The strange sound of the voices mumbling back and forth was enough to frighten a person near to death. Our kettle bubbled over and hissed into the fire, and all the while Mercy tugged the bed quilts off of our bed. But we didn't move from where we stood. "You think I should run and get Amos from the field?" I whispered to Laura. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the conversation in our loft stopped. Mr. Kelly came down the stairs slowly. I watched him hesitate on the last step and glance back up, as if he had changed his mind and would turn around even though he didn't. Laura stared at me, uncertain what to do. "Mr. Kelly," she began in a halting voice, "we've made tea if you'd like some. I don't know if you were intending to stay or not." Mr. Kelly gave us both a startled look. I was nearly sure he was going to say no, by the wary expression on his face, but then quite suddenly his face softened, and he nodded a little. "Thank you, Miss Carver," he said, coming over to the table. "Thank you. I'll have a small cup of tea. Yes." Awkwardly, he pulled up a chair and sat down at our big table. He was all elbows and knees, and couldn't seem to decide where to set his hat until he finally put it on the floor near his feet. "So has Indian John been here long, in your pa's cabin?" Mr. Kelly asked in a curious voice, while we fixed tea for him. Since he was company, my sister gave him our only unchipped teacup, and put some of our best loaf sugar on the table. "About 3 weeks," Laura answered. "My pa and the other men brought him here near the end of April." Then she added carefully, "How are you acquainted with him, Mr. Kelly?" I held in my breath, waiting for his answer. "Well," the man paused and stared down at his folded-up hands. "When I was 10 or 11 years old, growing up east of here, the two of us were friends." "Friends?" came flying out of my mouth. Mr. Kelly looked at me in a way that reminded me of Amos when he thought I had said something foolish. "Yes, we were good friends," he repeated. He told us that Amic's father was the chief of a small band of Chippewas, Ojibways, as they call themselves, he said. Mr. Kelly described how the Indians used to return every spring from their maple sugar grounds and stay on his pa's land through the summer. He glanced at Laura and asked her if she had ever heard of the Nibinshi River in the eastern part of Ohio, but she shook her head no. Well, the band always came to fish on our river, as they had done for years and years, I suppose, long before we had come, he explained. Mr. Kelly said that Amic and some of the other Indians were near to his age. "I had 4 brothers when I was growing up," he told us, "and we would play games and run all day with Amic and the other boys. When our chores were done, I was quick with languages. My pa said I had an ear for it, so I learned to speak with them as well as anyone. I could hardly even imagine the scene in my mind. Our Ma opening up the door to our cabin and letting us play with Indian children. Even Laura gave a surprised gasp. "Your pa and ma? They allowed you to do that?" Mr. Kelly studied his cup of tea as he was thinking hard. "Indians aren't... Well, they aren't. Forgive me for saying this," he paused and stumbled over his words. "Well, it was my belief, and it was my pa's belief, too. The Indians are as human as white men. Truthfully, in a great many respects they are, Miss Carver," he stammered, "and in some ways more so." There was an uncomfortable long silence after he spoke. I drank a big gulp of tea and peered over the top of my cup at my sister Laura, but I didn't dare to breathe a word about all of the things Indian John had given to us, or how I sometimes thought Indians were human too. "I don't see know how the murder of innocent folks can be counted as human, Mr. Kelly, Laura said finally, in a strong voice that echoed Ma's Bible, reading one. Even if he was once your friend, how can you call his actions human? No, certainly not, Mr. Kelly answered, quickly. But perhaps what everyone believes, Mr. Kelly hesitated and looked down at the table. Perhaps it isn't all true, he finished. I stared at Mr. Kelly. Even Laura seemed startled. Are you saying that our Pa's Indian didn't kill the trapper? She said. I don't know what to think. Truly, I don't, Mr. Kelly answered, rubbing his eyes wearily. Amick was always a good friend, for all the years we were growing up. He was never the kind to... Right at that moment, Pa and the boys came stomping through the doorway. Me and Laura were so taken by surprise we nearly knocked over our chairs in our rush to stand up. First thing Pa said, of course, was that nobody came out to the fields to tell him there was a fellow here to see him, and he gave me and Laura a hard look. After that, he sat down at the table and announced that he was Major Carver, and as the Major General of this part of Ohio, it was his duty to ask the fellow what business he had in our settlement. Mr. Kelly's narrow face turned as pink as a spring wildflower, and his elbow sent his spoon clattering to the floor. I'm Mr. Peter Kelly, Esquire, he managed to say, trying to reach for his spoon. I'm an acquaintance of the Chippewa Indian you have caught for murder. Acquaintance? Pa's voice was sharp. Mr. Kelly took a deep breath. I could see his shoulders rise up and down, and I felt sorry for him because of my Pa being the way he is. I'm newly in the practice of law, he said, real quiet, and I have come to see about perhaps defending him in his trial. My mouth just about fell to my feet when I heard that. All he had told us was that he was acquainted with the Indian from boyhood. He never breathed a word about defending him or being a lawyer. My Pa let out a loud hoot of laughter. Well, don't that be all, he said, smacking his hand down on the table. George, he hollered to my no-good cousin, George, this man is going to stand up for a savage. Don't that be all you ever heard? Cousin George grinned and shook his head. You a real lawyer? Pa asked. Yes, Mr. Kelly answered, as red as beets. You study many books? Yes, Mr. Kelly said. Well, I'll tell you what, Pa snorted and leaned forward. You got more education than you got brains, Mr. Peter Kelly, Esquire. Everybody around here knows that savage up there, Pa jabbed his finger toward the loft, killed a poor fellow who didn't have no reason to die. Killed him in cold blood with a tomahawk. He fixed his eyes on Peter Kelly's face. And if you keep that Indian up there hanging for his crime, you got the fewest from hanging for his crimes. You got the fewest brains of any man I know in this green earth. Pa stood up and pointed at the door. Now get out of my house. Seems like when a person is treated poorly by someone else, it makes you want to take their side. I don't know why. Maybe it isn't even a side you would have picked under the other circumstances. I couldn't imagine how Peter Kelly was going to stand up to my Pa, or how he was going to save an Indian who everybody believed was guilty. But as I watched Mr. Kelly pick up his hat and walk out the door with his skinny shoulders and too big coat, I was ashamed to say that I wanted to see him try.